Hello, this is Kai Marie, and welcome to the Healing Element Podcast. I'm really excited for you to join me this evening. I have a very special guest, Thurston Smith. Today's topic is breaking the cycle of addiction across generations. Today, we're going to be talking about intergenerational addiction. It is a difficult cycle to break, and Thurston is going to provide us with the steps families can take to begin to break the cycles of substance use. Thurston, thank you so much for being with me here this evening, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Kai. Glad to be with you. The Healing Element Podcast, and we certainly need as much healing as we can get. So thanks for this opportunity.
Yes, thank you. And you come to us with a wealth of experience, a wealth of knowledge. So I know that this is going to be a power-packed episode tonight. A little bit of your background, because Thurston has a phenomenal biography, right? So we could go on and on about his experience and what he brings to our conversation today. But really quick, I'm going to provide a brief summary, and then Thurston's going to tell us a little bit more about the work that he's done in the community as it relates to substance use. So Thurston Smith is a project team member for Paramount Consulting Group, PLLC, a minority-owned business that provides accreditation, readiness, quality assurance, and contract compliance for behavioral health organizations across the U.S. With over 25 years of experience in criminal and juvenile programming, mental health, and children and youth services, Thurston serves as an administrative and program surveyor for CARF International, an independent nonprofit creditor of health and human services programs. A recent retiree from the U.S. Veterans Health Administration, Thurston has held a variety of leadership positions during his civil service career, which includes congressional liaison, mental health program coordinator, employment services program manager, chemical dependency center program supervisor, education specialist, and a host of other leadership roles. Once again, Thurston, thank you so much and welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Kai. This is really exciting. I can't tell you the last time I've been live like this. This is really great. So I really thank you for the opportunity. The topic that we're talking about is an area that's near and dear to my heart. I started working in the mental health, substance abuse, and criminal justice fields well over 20 years ago. Started off at entry-level positions, and I think when I first came into the field, which like many of us that are in the health and human services industry, come into the field with a certain passion and certain drive for helping people. And some come into the field and find out that it's not for them. Well, Kai, I'm the exact opposite. When I came to the field, I knew that this was the place where God wanted me to be. So obviously, I stuck with it, developed and enhanced my skills, and found just multiple venues and multiple ways of helping people that are struggling with substance abuse and mental illness. Yes.
And one thing thank you so much for saying that, Thurston. One thing that I really appreciate about the work that you do is that I view as really a change agent. Wherever you go, you want to create change, and you want to be able to see, okay, this is where we started, but let's set up some metrics to see how we want to progress to move forward. Will you say that's kind of the mentality that you also brought to the world of substance use with the families that you were able to help in the organizations that you worked with?
Well, absolutely, and knowing that is kind of interesting that you use the right language and the right term when you said change, because I'm well known for stating that change occurs at the intersection of information and motivation. You generally need those two dynamics in order for people to make change, and make change that's actually going to be meaningful and beneficial. And so having worked in the addiction is a very complex medical condition that involves brain circuitry. It involves biochemical. It involves the environment. It involves genetics. So individuals that choose to work in this field are individuals that need to really hone in on the skills that are necessary to work effectively with this population.
Yeah, I totally appreciate that. And one thing that you said that really resonates with me. So besides doing the Healing Element podcast that focuses on intergenerational trauma and historical trauma and how do we break the cycle, the other part of the work that I do is around holistic living and how do you begin to heal from different pains, different traumas in a holistic manner. And exactly what you said is a holistic approach to working with an individual that may have a substance use disorder.
Well, exactly. And so let me do this, right? Let's first define what addiction is. I'll give you both the clinical definition, then I'm going to give you the layman's definition, right? So I'll give you the clinical definition first. Addiction is defined as a pervasive and maladaptive pattern of substance use that is characterized by the subject's continued use of the substance despite, and that's a key word, Kai, despite adverse consequences. Addiction, another way of defining it clinically as well, is a complex brain disease, like I described previously, that involves brain chemistry, it involves genetic history, it involves the environment. So it's not just about an individual using. There's so many misconceptions about addiction, and I think we're probably going to touch a little bit on those points as well. But that's the clinical or medical definition that I just provided you. Now, here's the layman's term. Here's the layman's definition. This is precisely what you would want to say to someone just in the general population in describing addiction. You can, in layman's terms, you describe addiction two ways. One, the substance controls you, you don't control it. And two, it causes problems. That's the layman's definition of addiction. The substance controls you, you don't control it. And secondly, it causes problems.
Thank you for laying that out because I know that the language has changed, right, from substance, was it addiction or not addiction, but abuse? And now we use the term, has that language changed a bit or?
Right. So what has changed is the language used within the medical community, right? What has changed is the language used in two manuals, right? One manual is the International Classification for Diseases. And then the language has changed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. The medical field are in a continuous process of evaluating the criteria for every disorder you can think of, from diabetes to hepatitis to glaucoma and to mental illness to drug abuse. And so they didn't really change the scope of what addiction is. They just changed some of the terminology. But by and large, we're still talking about addiction, even though in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, they refer to it as substance use disorders, but it's still addiction. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. See, we got the right person here tonight to break it all the way down so that we can understand. So I appreciate that. So I know tonight, I should say, we're going to be talking about the addiction cycle, how that can be a generational cycle and why it can be. But before I jump into that, we do have a question from a listener. Does Thurston believe that addiction has become a bigger problem under COVID?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And and I thank that person for the question. The reason for that is I have been doing my periodic studying. In fact, I had a training yesterday, in fact, with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And although it didn't cover that specific area, there were experts on this particular training session that referenced some of the data that's coming in. And then in addition to that, I've been hearing anecdotal information, right? And anecdotal information is simply uh, uh, everyday people talking about their experiences. And so yes, we have both. There's some research coming in. Well, not that's so much as research. There's data coming in as it relates to the increase in admissions and treatment programs. And then secondly, I'm hearing anecdotal information in the community regarding individuals engaging more in heavy alcohol use and drug use. And that also includes, there has been a rise, particularly in my community in Memphis, Tennessee, in domestic violence. And all of that goes hand in hand.
Wow. So because that we're starting to, so this, what we're talking about tonight is then very timely because we're starting to see an increase in substance use and how that then connects also to domestic violence. Because what we want to do is show people what you can do to begin a journey of healing. And also, if you maybe grew up in such environments, what you can do to make sure that you're not passing that on to the next generation.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah. So can you talk to us a little bit about addiction when it's when it's happening and it's being passed on from one generation to the next? Is that something that you see when you've been working with families, and why does that seem to be the case?
Well, for those of us that are seasoned, Kai, those of us that are well established in both the substance abuse treatment field and mental health treatment fields, have coined and have come to understand that addiction is a family illness. This is precisely why when treating individuals for addiction and even other mental health conditions and disorders, you want to absolutely positively involve the family in that process. And there are a couple of reasons why you want to do that. Number one, individuals that are suffering from addiction are sick. And I don't mean that term as an insult. I mean that term squarely and solely to indicate that they have a severe health care problem. They are sick. They are sick mentally, they are sick physically, and they are sick spiritually. Having said that, addiction affects three primary relationships: the relationship that one has with oneself, the relationship that one has with others, and the relationship that one has with God, or if they want to, whomever they want to refer to as their higher power. So if addiction impacts three primary relationships, then what are we really saying? That what we're really saying, Kai, is that addiction affects everything. So that means if I'm an abuser, if I'm addicted to substances, and I live with you, Kai, and to live with you is a clear indication that we have an intimate relationship, that you can be my mother, my sister, my aunt, you could even be my wife. You cannot live with someone suffering from addiction and not be impacted emotionally, mentally, and spiritually by that relationship, because the nature of relationships of individuals who suffer from addiction are relationships characterized by severe dysfunction. And let's talk a little, let me give you a definition of that real briefly. Many people, when you hear the word dysfunction, people have a tendency to think that that means problem. The word dysfunction, being by itself, does not mean problem. The word dysfunction means that an individual has a very poor or ineffective problem-solving system. Did you catch that? So what that really means is that when individuals are dysfunctional, it means that they don't handle life well. Everybody has problems, but that doesn't mean that everyone is living dysfunctionally. dysfunctionally. Individuals that live dysfunctionally simply cannot handle and manage life effectively. That's what the term dysfunction is. Here's the other thing to keep in mind. Denial is at the core and basis of all mental health disorders, including addiction. I will repeat that. Denial is at the core or at the foundation of all mental health disorders, including addiction. This is precisely why, not to go so much on a tangent, but this is precisely why, in even working in the mental health field, one of the most common reports from clients working in the field, and I know if there's people in your audience that have a background in mental health, this should make them smile, is to hear when clients say, when the counselor asks the client, why did you stop taking your medication? And you know what the client almost always says in the mental health field? Well, I started feeling better. And everybody laughs at that. Well, and here's the thing, you started feeling better because you was taking your medicine. And nobody gives them permission to stop taking their medicine, but that's one of the biggest strategies that mental health counselors have in working in that particular discipline, is getting clients to adhere to their medication. So if denial is at the foundation and at the core of addiction and all mental illnesses, then the initial strategy that has to occur in any intervention as it relates to working with people who suffer from addiction is opening their eyes. That means bringing attention to their condition. And there's several strategies that many of us have with doing that. And in those strategies, what we're really describing is our intervention methods, some type of intervention methods. Unfortunately, Kai, most individuals that end up in treatment as a result of some severe consequence. So it's almost like a woman is no more pregnant at 9 months than she is at 1 month. There's no such thing as half pregnant. However, there is a difference between the fetus in the third trimester, am I right? As opposed to the first trimester. And what I'm describing is what we refer to as progression. Having said that, the individual that you see on the street that you know is suffering from alcoholism, they were not always on the street. They did not always look like that. The point that I'm trying to bring home to you right now is that individual that you see on the street that's suffering from alcoholism and is homeless was just as much an alcoholic 15 years ago as they are now. They're no more an alcoholic being on the street homeless than they were 15 years ago. The only difference is the progression of the disease. Addiction is in part physiological, addiction is in part psychological, and addiction is in part behavioral. The physiological aspects of addiction are defined by two things: tolerance and withdrawal. Tolerance is characterized by the need to use more of the substance in order to achieve the desired effect. So Jamie, when Jamie was 15, he had his very first beer. One can of beer, and he was just about as lit up as Christmas tree, right? Jamie continued to drink. So now at 18, it takes him 2.5 cans of beer to give him the same effect that one beer gave him at the age of 15. Now Jamie is 23. It now takes Jamie an entire 6-pack of beer to give him the same effect that one beer gave him at the age of 15. Now Jamie is 35, and it takes him a whole 12-pack of Budweiser to give him the same effect that one beer gave him at the age of 15. What I just described for you there is referred to as progression. And that is a component of the physiological aspect of addiction. The other component physiological aspect of addiction is withdrawal, which is very powerful. Withdrawal is denoted or characterized by whenever the substance is withdrawn or taken away, that the individual's body reacts to the absence of the substance. That is very powerful. So we have to stop. People have to stop with this thing about if you suffer from addiction, it's mind over matter, and if you don't mind, I don't matter. That it doesn't work. Addiction is an illness. It's progressive. That means it gets worse over and occurs in stages. It's chronic, meaning that there is no known cure for addiction today. Addiction is like HIV. Once you got it, you got it. Addiction is like colorectal cancer to some degree, and many other diseases. Chronic means once you got it, you got it. And addiction is primary. These are all clinical definition terms out of the medical community. Addiction is primary. Primary means that it has its own symptomology. It has its own symptoms, A, and B, it is not caused by another condition. Addiction has its own history, its own historical framework, and it has its own criteria. Addiction is not caused by mental illness. Like addiction is not caused by depression. However, an individual may drink more while they're depressed, right? So I'm not saying that there's not a relationship, but depression itself doesn't cause addiction. If we had to argue that point more, from another perspective, I would lean more on the side that addiction leads to depression. That's a better conversation. But having said all of that, addiction is primary because it has its own symptoms.
Wow, thank you so much for laying all that out, because I think that provides just a beautiful snapshot of exactly the conversation that we're having tonight. So thank you for breaking that down. I do have a question. Does this process also apply to addictions to prescription drugs?
A drug is a drug is a drug. Let me say that one more time. A drug is a drug is a drug. It makes no difference. An individual's body, an individual's brain chemistry, an individual's physiological makeup cannot differentiate between drugs they purchase off the street from drugs that they get, prescribed by a doctor. When an individual suffers from addiction, their body and their brain only knows its response to drugs. Makes no difference where those drugs come from. So individuals that have unintentionally, inadvertently developed addiction as a result of a legitimate pain condition, even though the pain condition was legitimate, and now they have developed physiological dependence upon the drug, they are no less an addict than the person that's addicted to crack cocaine. And we need to understand that. This is precisely why we need, number one, we need more education surrounding exactly what addiction is, how it manifests, number one. And number two, we need more available treatment programs in our community.
And to that point, as far as becoming more educated, do you also see in your experience that people kind of have a perception of what addiction looks like, right? Because you could have someone that says, everyone around them is saying, listen, you definitely have a substance use problem. And they're like, no, I go to work on time. I'm still functioning. Can you talk a little bit about the person that kind of has it all together, but everyone around them is saying something's wrong?
Well, I'd be happy to talk about that. I gave you an example of that, Kai, 5 minutes ago when I talked about the wino or the alcoholic that we see out on the street. Always remember that they were not always out there, right? They were not always there. Nobody goes from being healthy. So I'm going back to this conversation about progression again, right? No one goes from being perfectly healthy to being totally sick overnight. I'll say one more time for your audience. No one goes from being perfectly healthy to being totally sick overnight. It was a progression. And that progression relating to addiction is very, very subtle. I never forget years ago, back in New York, and I was with my grandfather, and he was teaching me about a clock and about the second hand. And he said, I want you to look and tell me when that hand moves. And I kept looking and I was just amazed. I can't see it move. But he said, when we started this game, it was 8:30. Now where we're at now, it's 8:45. I never saw it move. That's how addiction is, very, very subtle. And that's the progression of it. So when you gave that description of the individual that says, well, I can't be an alcoholic, I can't be an addict because I still have a job. I can't be an alcoholic addict because I still go to church every Sunday. I can't be an alcoholic and an addict because I don't shake. I don't go to work late, or at least I don't go to work late that often, right? So let me just share this with you. Anytime somebody says that, that's a clear indication that they are in denial. There are three cousins of denial. And I coined this term several years ago, and I've never heard anybody else say it prior to. I'm just letting you know that I coined this phrase 3 years ago. There are three cousins of denial: minimization, rationalization, and justification. Anytime you have to come up with some response to support behavior that's not healthy, that's denial. So I'm not as bad as Joe and so and so and so and so. You're minimizing, or I'm entitled to drink this 12-pack today because I worked hard all week. Now you're rationalizing, right? Or rather, you're justifying, right? And then here's the other one. You see that guy across the street that's sleeping under the bridge? That's your alcoholic. There's your rationalization. Minimization, rationalization, and justification. Again, understand that addiction progresses in three distinct stages, three very distinct stages. Use, which is just characterized by the periodic use of the substance with no adverse impact on functioning. But then with continued use, you move into the next stage, which is abuse. Abuse is characterized by there is a clear impact in one or more areas of that individual's life. Thus, social, that individual does not attend Bible studies every Wednesday. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because if you see a significant shift in a person's normal, what you can kind of classify, right, as normal behavior, that's an indication that there's a problem. That's just one indication. uh, the absence of, here's something that's prominent with individuals that suffer from addiction or may be developing an addiction. A shift away from activities that they normally enjoy. Now, that could be the Bible study, but that could be bowling. That could be meeting with fraternity brothers. I mean, this whole list that goes on and on and on. So having said that, the people that are most likely to notice that shift in behavior are the people that are most close to them, Kyle. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And to that point, when we're people, as you had mentioned earlier, if your spouse maybe has a substance use disorder, if you're a child and maybe your parent, can you share with us a little bit of maybe the experiences that a spouse or child growing up in that type of environment may have? And then, that could also affect their relationships, especially a child, right, growing up in that type of environment. And then when they're going out into the world as an adult, I'm sure what they have experienced growing up with a parent or both parents had a substance use disorder, how may that impact them? So we have two questions here, one about a spouse and then about a child growing up in that type of environment.
Okay, very good. So in responding to that, you also open up an opportunity for me to explain the dynamics of addiction a little bit more. There are two components of addiction: susceptibility and availability. I'll say again, there are two components of addiction: susceptibility and availability. Susceptibility is determined by two things: genetics and environment. Susceptibility is determined by two things: genetics and environment. So when we refer to genetics, what we're actually talking about is that there is a familial, that's Latin for family, that there is a familial, there's a family history of substance use and or dysfunction, because there's really no separation when it comes to the dynamics of the family. So there's either a history of severe dysfunction in the family and or a history of substance use. Environment simply means that you are either being raised as a child or you're living as an adult in an environment that promotes dysfunction, in an environment that promotes substance use. Even if you looked at even if you remember the movies Boys in the Hood, when one of those guys, I think one of the characters playing Ice Cube, one of them was giving the little boy some beer. Oh, no. That was Menace to Society. Okay. That's the kind of environment, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be that extreme as characterized in the movie, but I just wanted to use that as an example. An environment that promotes the use of substances. So two components of addiction are susceptibility and availability. I just defined susceptibility for you. Availability simply means exactly what it said. It's accessible. When you have both of those dynamics occurring at the same time, it's almost, the likelihood of developing a substance use disorder is heightened. So back to the dynamics of the family. So let me give you an example, and I hope I have enough time to do this.
You're good on time.
I was living in Hilton Head, South Carolina, many, many years ago, right? And with my wife. And my daughter, it was springtime. Flowers were blooming, that kind of stuff. And My daughter was outside playing with her friend, and somehow her friend came into the house. And you all might smile after you hear this story. So her friend came into the house, and my daughter didn't know that her friend was in the house. But my friend was in the house, and she was sitting on my wife's lap. My wife was cuddling, my daughter's friend. And so suddenly my daughter came in, and this was a Kodak moment. You have to understand what I'm trying to say. When my daughter opened that door, and our daughter was like 4 or 5, something like that. But when she opened that door and saw her friend sitting on my wife's lap, her whole demeanor, I never forget this, her whole facial expression and everything changed. So you got to watch what she did. She held her head down and she just inched closer and closer and closer, very methodically, all the way up to my wife, who still had her friend in my daughter's friend in her lap, and she looked at her. My daughter looked at her friend and she said, "That's my niecey." And then she turned around and walked away. I learned so much from that. So let me explain to you why I'm telling you that story, which is a true story. Children have to have a nurturing environment in order to be whole. When they live in an environment where they don't know whether their daddy's going to come home happy on Friday or whether their daddy's going to come home with an axe, it makes them insecure. I want you to think about that word insecure. At that moment, my daughter was 5 years old. She was insecure, but she should be at that age because she's not mature. She does not have a full knowledge of self. That's why she made the comment to her friend, letting her know that you might be in my mama's lap, but that's my mama. So let's get that straight. When children are raised in dysfunctional environments, it makes it difficult for them to establish themselves as human beings. And guess what? Those dynamics create pathways for other dysfunctional behaviors, like substance abuse. That contributes to the cycle of addiction. That contributes to the cycle of dysfunction. And that's precisely why kids like that end up getting in gangs. I saw a documentary, never forget it, 15 years ago on either 2020 or 60 Minutes. And it was a documentary that focused on gangs. And one of the most highlights, one of the most prominent points, Kai, during the documentary is that all of the kids in the gangs all came from dysfunctional families. But guess what? Think about this. The kids left from one dysfunctional family to become a member in another dysfunctional family. Ironically, many of those kids found more love, more favor, right? And here's the operative word, acceptance. More acceptance in the gang than they did in their actual families of origin. That's the scope of dysfunction. So when we talk about dysfunction, when we talk about addiction, we can just broaden the conversation and as it relates to family dysfunction overall. This is precisely why when individuals who are suffering from addiction come into treatment, while any good treatment program is going to ask about that client's or that patient's family. Any good treatment program is going to try to include the family in the treatment process. Why? Because guess what, Kai? People don't want to hear this, but the family members are sick too. You cannot be in that environment. You may not be using the substance, but you're unhealthy too. That's why everybody, the entire family has to get healthy. I hope I answered the question. I'm loving this conversation today.
Yes, no, you did a excellent job with that question, and we do want to get into more steps that families can take if they're either in this situation or now they're out of it and they want to start making a process to begin to heal. Before I do that, we do have a question. Um, does institutional or personal play a role in the addiction behaviors among people of color?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Can you, if you need to paraphrase that?
If he's still on, I don't know if it's saying what people of color experience in this country, in the US, if that has a role in how we, okay, he's back. If that has a role in how maybe some people that are in people of color communities, that they decide to manage the stress of being, living in this country. I'm gathering that could be the question.
Well, here's the funny thing. The current data, and I would encourage whoever made that question to go to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services website, because they're the arm of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that's in the business of capturing data, and they capture data through primarily two mechanisms. One, through reports of people seeking treatment in treatment programs within the country, and two, they utilize what they refer to as the National United States Household Survey on Drug Abuse. And so they use that mechanism to gather trends and statistics as it relates to what populations are seeking treatment more than others. And so this is what we've learned about substance abuse in the African American community. It does not appear, right, that the African American population uses substances far more greater than other populations. However, what we have identified is the impact of the use of substances within the African American community is far more greater than other populations. And that's because of all of the other overlapping social problems that are occurring within the African American community as well. So there is a correlation, not in all instances direct, but indirect because of race.
Thank you for that good question. So now we want to kind of shift to talk about some steps that families can take. So say if you are listening to our episode tonight, or you're watching and you're saying, this sounds like my family or somebody that I know. Thurston, can you give us some steps that families can start to take, or someone that maybe has a substance use disorder, so maybe a two-pronged approach to this, steps that can be taken to begin that healing process to make sure that we can stop this generational cycle?
Okay, very good. Great question. So number one, identify the problem and identify the problem early. Do not call the problem something else. Do not make excuses for the problem. Do not give a leeway or allow or co-sign in any way behavior. If you identify behavior and it's inappropriate, call it that. Don't give any leeway or window for the individuals that's displaying the problem to continue it. Because if you do that, then what you're really doing is co-signing the behavior. Secondly, you have to create some kind of intervention method. Now that may sound like a fancy word, but what I'm really saying is somebody needs to confront that issue. And I believe I've said it correctly, because you really want to confront the problem, not necessarily the person. There's a difference. So I'll say that again. You really want to confront the problem, but not necessarily the person. The way of confronting the problem with the person is not by pointing fingers, is not by saying you, but it is by saying, "Hey, Ricky, you know, I've noticed you're not dressing as nice as you normally do. You're missing some of your important meetings. You're not exercising like you normally do. You know, noticing you're staying out, like, you know, things like that. Things like that. You want to simply to that loved one, to that brother, that sister, the husband or wife. You simply want to bring to their attention what you're observing about their behavior. But then this is how you solidify it. After you present that list to them, then you tell them, and let me tell you how it's affecting me. You see where I'm coming from? That's how you cap that. But understand, individuals do not necessarily always hide. They don't necessarily have to do that by themselves. There are people that they can do that with other family members. If anyone in the family is a part of a church, which or you know a faith part of the faith community in any way, then I would encourage them to get their pastors to participate in that process with them. If you know, but if you know anybody, and there's something really there's something profoundly spiritual about that as well, particularly when you have several family members relating to the addicted person that all get together and have a conversation, not a beat up session. Because I'm telling you right now, you're not going to beat anybody. Trust what I'm telling you. You're not going to beat anybody into treatment. You're not going to beat anybody into submission. Addiction is more powerful than you're yelling and screaming at them, no matter how much you love them. You get more bang for the buck through carefrontation, not confrontation. And carefrontation is simply about mirroring, right? Remember that word, mirroring to the person what you see when you see them. That's what that's all about. This is what we see happening with you. And done in a very careful and a thoughtful and a loving way has is likely to have a better outcome than you yelling and screaming and trying to beat and then say, you need to get your you understand? So I hope I answered that question. Was that satisfactory?
It was more than satisfactory. Thank you so much. And for those that are watching us right now, please make sure you give this video a thumbs up and please share in your networks. This is a very important conversation that we're having tonight, especially as one of our listeners said, we're in the midst of COVID and, you know, it's very stressful times. And so it can be impacting everyone differently. So make sure that you share this important information. Again, thumbs up, share, and also subscribe to the Healing Element podcast. Thurston, are there any more tips? I know we're coming close to the end. We could go on and on and on with this very important conversation. It's been such a pleasure to have you on. Are there any other tips or strategies that you want to provide to families listening that are looking to help their loved one?
Well, here's one thing. Family members can go to www.nida. That's www.nida.gov. That is the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services National Institute on Drug Abuse. There are plenty of materials, and in fact, the materials that they have are free to the public that you can order. Schools use them, and they just have a library that's rich and full with resourceful information for individuals, for community organizations, churches, schools, so on and so forth. And I mean, you can just go on the website to just familiarize yourself with, with useful information as it relates to drug abuse and tips on how to identify it and tips and strategies for responding to it. Overall, I believe the last piece that I would want to say to your audience is understanding that individuals who do suffer from substance, they are unhealthy. They're not. It's not about being. If alcoholics drink and use alcohol the way they drink and use alcohol because they cannot not drink and use alcohol that way. That is the nature of alcoholism and drug addiction. That they cannot not use the way that they use. And a normal person will take a drink, give them a drink, a 1 ounce shot of whiskey. They'll take a little sip, put it down. They may drink the rest. They may leave it alone. Somebody that suffers from alcoholism, you give them one drink and it's all over. Why? Because one is too many and 1,000 is never enough. They can't stop. And that's because of what happens when they ingest the chemical. Their addicts and alcoholics' response to alcohol and other drugs is very different than the response of normal people to substances. And that's what we have to understand. They are unhealthy and they need to be treated as if they are unhealthy. Alcoholism and drug abuse is a health condition. And in fact, it is one of America's primary public health crises. Yeah.
And you know what, Thurston, I'm glad that the approach to bringing healing to individuals that have substance use disorder has changed. And now we're looking at it as a whole family unit. Because when you said that the whole family is sick, I think that's so important because that person has impacted everyone who is in that household with them and maybe even extended. So to see that now it's that that holistic approach is being taken to bring healing to this issue, I think is so critical and so important.
Exactly.
So thank you so much, Thurston, for coming on the podcast. I would love to have you back on anytime.
Let's do it.
And for those that are listening or watching, if people want to learn more about you, because I'm sure they do, and contact you, how can they do that?
My email address is T as in Tom, EESMITH, the number 1 at hotmail.com. That's TEE Smith, the number 1 at hotmail.com. And I'll even give it myself. Everybody else has it. Number is 901-825-4492. That's 901-825-4492. And Kai, I believe that you have my website on your announcement. So you can also, if you go onto the link, if you go to the website where this podcast is announced, my website is there. You can also contact me through the website. Thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Yes, no, I've thoroughly enjoyed having you on. And yes, all of your contact information will be in the description box of the video, so that way people will be able to reach out to you for sure. So thank you so much for coming on. This is awesome. This is such good information. So I really appreciate it. Thank you all for listening. Again, make sure you give this video a thumbs up and also share, and make sure you subscribe to the Healing Element podcast. Also, make sure you hit the notification bell to know when I go live. And I hope that you join me here next Tuesday at 8 p.m. For some reason, all day I've been thinking 7. Thurston and I were talking about that. For some reason, I've had 7 on the brain. But it's 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and you can join me here next Tuesday. And I will be announcing who my guest will be tomorrow. So if you want to learn more about me and my services, please visit KaiMarie.com. Please also follow me on social media. on Instagram, Kai Marie _ LLC, and also at The Healing Element. And you can also find me, of course, on Facebook, Kai Marie LLC. Thank you all so much for joining me tonight. Have a great evening, and I will see you next Tuesday.